"You don't belong here, boy. This is a courthouse, not a homeless shelter." The words cut through the marble-lined corridor of the Federal District Court like a blade. Officer Marcus Bradley's hand instinctively moved to his handcuffs as he stared down the elderly black man sitting quietly on the wooden bench outside Courtroom 7. The man wore a simple grey suit that had seen better days, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap, his silver hair neatly trimmed despite the early morning hour. What Officer Bradley didn't know was that the photograph tucked in that man's breast pocket would soon turn his world upside down. It was 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in downtown Washington, D.C., and the courthouse was already buzzing with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past with their briefcases, clerks shuffled paperwork, and the usual morning crowd of defendants, witnesses, and family members filled the waiting areas. But Officer Bradley, a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Department, had zeroed in on one person who, in his mind, simply didn't fit the pristine environment of federal justice. The man on the bench was General William Bull Thompson, though no one in that courthouse knew it yet. At 68 years old, he had spent 4 decades serving his country, rising through the ranks from a young lieutenant in Vietnam to becoming one of only a handful of 4-star generals in the U.S. Army. But today he wasn't wearing his dress blues adorned with ribbons and medals. Today, he was just another citizen, summoned to testify in a case that would finally bring justice to soldiers who had been denied their rightful benefits. If you're watching this story unfold, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Officer Bradley announced, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to wielding. His partner, Officer Jennifer Walsh, a newer recruit who had learned to follow Bradley's lead, positioned herself nearby, though something about the situation made her uncomfortable. General Thompson looked up slowly, his dark eyes meeting Bradley's with a calm that spoke of a man who had faced far worse than an overzealous police officer. "I'm waiting to be called as a witness, officer. Is there a problem?" "The problem," Bradley said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to what he thought was a threatening whisper, "is that you look like you've been sleeping rough. This is a federal courthouse, not a place for your kind to loiter." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several people in the corridor turned to look, sensing the tension building. A young attorney stopped mid-conversation with her client, while an elderly white woman clutched her purse tighter and moved to a different bench. But what Officer Bradley couldn't see was the fire beginning to burn behind General Thompson's calm exterior, the same fire that had led him through 3 tours of duty and countless battles for justice. General Thompson's military training kicked in automatically, assess the threat, control the environment, protect the mission. His mission today was simple: testify truthfully about the systematic denial of benefits to black veterans, a wrong that had persisted for decades and was finally being addressed in federal court. "Officer," the general said quietly, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. "Perhaps this will clarify things." Bradley's hand shot to his weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them. You're under arrest for trespassing and suspicious behavior." As Bradley reached for his handcuffs, General Thompson remained perfectly still. "Officer, before you make a mistake you can't undo, I suggest you look at what I'm about to show you." What was in that photograph? What truth was about to shatter Officer Bradley's assumptions? And how would this moment of prejudice transform into a reckoning that would echo through the halls of justice? The courthouse corridor had become a stage, and everyone within earshot was now an unwilling audience to a drama that was about to unfold. Officer Bradley's fingers hovered over his handcuffs, his training warring with something deeper, a prejudice that had been reinforced by years of assumptions and stereotypes that he'd never bothered to examine. General Thompson understood the dynamics at play better than anyone in that hallway. He had witnessed this same scene play out countless times during his military career. Good soldiers making bad decisions based on superficial judgments, only to discover that the person they had underestimated possessed knowledge, experience, or authority that dwarfed their own. The general's weathered hands moved with deliberate precision as he slowly withdrew a leather wallet from his breast pocket. The movement was so measured, so controlled, that even Officer Bradley paused, something in the older man's bearing giving him momentary hesitation. "Officer Bradley," a voice called from behind them. Judge Patricia Hamilton's clerk, Maria Santos, had emerged from Courtroom 7, tablet in hand. Is there a problem here? We're ready for the witness testimony. Bradley didn't turn around, his focus locked on General Thompson. Ma'am, I'm detaining this individual for questioning. He appears to be loitering and... Loitering? Maria's voice carried a note of confusion. Officer, this is General Thompson. He's our star witness today. The entire case revolves around his testimony. The words hit Officer Bradley like a physical blow, but his pride wouldn't let him back down immediately. General? Ma'am, with all due respect, this individual doesn't look like any general I've ever seen. It was at that moment that General Thompson opened his wallet, revealing not just his military ID, but a photograph that would forever change the trajectory of this encounter. The black and white image showed a much younger version of himself, standing alongside President Ronald Reagan, both men in military dress uniforms, the president's hand on the then Colonel Thompson's shoulder during a Medal of Honor ceremony. But it wasn't just the photograph that commanded attention. It was the calm authority that seemed to radiate from General Thompson as he spoke. Officer Bradley, I've spent 42 years serving this country. I've led men and women into battle, advised 3 presidents on military strategy, and yes, I've also experienced the kind of prejudice you're displaying right now more times than I care to count. The corridor had grown quiet, except for the soft whispers of onlookers who were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. Officer Walsh, Bradley's partner, took a step back, her face flushing with embarrassment as she recognized the magnitude of the mistake her partner was making. During my second tour in Vietnam, General Thompson continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, I had a sergeant who refused to take orders from me because he couldn't see past my skin color. That sergeant's prejudice cost the lives of 3 good soldiers. I promised myself then that I would never let such ignorance go unchallenged, whether on a battlefield or in a courthouse corridor. Bradley's hand slowly moved away from his handcuffs, but his jaw remained rigid. The photograph in Thompson's wallet seemed to burn into his retinas, the unmistakable evidence of a distinguished career that had spanned decades of service to the very country Bradley claimed to protect and serve. Maria Santos stepped forward, her professional demeanor barely concealing her outrage. General Thompson is here testifying in the case of Davidson versus Department of Veterans Affairs. His testimony is crucial in addressing the systematic discrimination that prevented thousands of black veterans from receiving their rightful benefits after World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was a veteran being harassed while preparing to testify about the very discrimination he was experiencing in real time. Judge Hamilton's voice suddenly boomed from the courtroom doorway. What exactly is happening out here? General Thompson, we're ready for your testimony. Officer Bradley found himself at a crossroads that would define not just this moment, but potentially the rest of his career. The evidence of his mistake was undeniable, witnessed by dozens of people, including court officials who would undoubtedly report this incident. But the real question remained, would pride and prejudice continue to blind him, or would this moment become a catalyst for something greater? Judge Patricia Hamilton stood in the doorway of her courtroom, her black robes a stark contrast to the marble walls, her expression shifting from mild irritation to growing concern as she took in the scene before her. At 62, she had presided over countless cases, but the tableau in her courthouse corridor was particularly troubling. A distinguished witness being confronted by an officer whose motivations appeared to have nothing to do with legitimate law enforcement. Officer, Judge Hamilton's voice carried the weight of 3 decades on the federal bench. I need an explanation. Now. The courtroom behind her had filled with attorneys, plaintiffs, and media representatives who had come to witness what many considered a landmark case in veterans' rights. Word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through the courthouse's informal communication network, clerks whispering to bailiffs, attorneys texting colleagues, court reporters sharing knowing glances. Officer Bradley found himself trapped in a moment that seemed to expand and contract simultaneously. Time slowed as he realized that every person within sight was now focused on his next words, his next action. The photograph in General Thompson's hand seemed to glow with an authority that made Bradley's badge feel suddenly insignificant. Your Honor, Bradley began, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, I was conducting a routine security check. This individual was... He paused. The words looked suspicious, dying in his throat as he stared at the image of President Reagan, shaking hands with the very man he had been prepared to arrest. General Thompson stepped forward, his movement fluid despite his years. Judge Hamilton, Officer Bradley was doing his job as he saw fit. However, I believe this incident perfectly illustrates the very issues we're here to address today. The General's diplomatic response surprised everyone, especially Officer Bradley, who had expected anger, demands for apologies, or threats of lawsuits. Instead, he was witnessing a masterclass in leadership, using a moment of conflict to highlight a larger truth, rather than simply seeking personal vindication. The systematic discrimination that black veterans have faced didn't end when we returned from overseas, General Thompson continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the corridor. It followed us into civilian life, into government offices, into courthouses. It manifested in assumptions about our character, our capabilities, our right to be in certain spaces. Officer Walsh, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally found her voice. General Thompson, we apologize. This should never have happened, but Officer Bradley's pride wrestled with the undeniable evidence before him. The photograph showed not just a meeting with a president, but the culmination of a career that had broken barriers and challenged the very system that Bradley had unknowingly been perpetuating. 43 years ago, General Thompson said, looking directly at Bradley, I was a young lieutenant reporting to Fort Benning. The desk sergeant took one look at me and assigned me to kitchen duty, assuming that a black officer couldn't possibly be qualified for anything more significant. It took 3 weeks and a direct order from the base commander to get me to my actual assignment. The story landed like a physical blow to everyone listening. Here was a man who had risen to the highest ranks of military leadership, yet had faced the same prejudicial assumptions that Officer Bradley had just displayed. Judge Hamilton stepped fully into the corridor, her presence commanding immediate attention. Officer Bradley, I want to be very clear about something. General Thompson is not just a witness in today's proceedings. He's a plaintiff representative in a class action suit that affects over 30,000 veterans who were denied benefits based on discriminatory practices. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. 30,000 veterans. 30,000 men and women who had served their country only to return home to face the very discrimination that Officer Bradley had just demonstrated. Furthermore, the judge continued, this courthouse has security cameras that have recorded this entire interaction. Given that General Thompson is a key witness in a federal civil rights case, this incident will need to be thoroughly investigated. Officer Bradley's face drained of color as the full implications of his actions became clear. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a career-defining moment that would likely become part of the official court record, a living example of the discrimination that the case was designed to address. General Thompson folded the photograph carefully and returned it to his wallet. Officer Bradley, I don't want your career destroyed over this, but I do want you to understand that the uniform you wear should represent justice for all citizens, regardless of their appearance or your assumptions about their background. The moment of truth had arrived. Would Officer Bradley find the courage to confront his own prejudices, or would pride and fear drive him to double down on his mistake? And how would this confrontation change not just the lives of those present, but the very case that General Thompson had come to support? The weight of Judge Hamilton's words settled over the corridor like a heavy blanket. Officer Bradley's mind raced through the implications: security cameras, federal civil rights cases, career consequences that could extend far beyond this single moment. But more unsettling than the professional ramifications was the growing realization that he had become a living embodiment of the very injustice that General Thompson had spent decades fighting. The general noticed the conflict playing out across Bradley's face and recognized something familiar: the internal struggle of a person confronting their own biases for the first time. It was a look he had seen countless times in his military career, particularly when integrating units or working with soldiers who had never served alongside black officers. Officer Bradley, General Thompson said quietly, stepping closer so their conversation wouldn't carry to the growing crowd of onlookers. I've seen that look before. You're not a bad man. You're a man who made assumptions based on limited perspective. The question now is what you choose to do with this moment. Meanwhile, the courthouse had begun to buzz with activity as word of the confrontation spread. Court reporters discreetly activated their recording devices, attorneys whispered urgently into their phones, and Maria Santos was already fielding calls from news outlets who had gotten wind of the incident through their courthouse contacts. Detective Sarah Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the D.C. Metropolitan Police who specialized in community relations, had arrived at the courthouse for an unrelated matter when she noticed the commotion. Unlike Officer Bradley, Martinez had worked extensively on police community trust initiatives and immediately recognized the explosive potential of the situation unfolding before her. "Officer Bradley," she called out as she approached, her voice carrying the authority of rank and experience. "I need to speak with you immediately." Bradley turned to face his superior, relief and apprehension warring across his features. Detective Martinez had a reputation for fairness, but also for holding officers accountable when they crossed lines that damaged police community relations. General Thompson used the momentary distraction to address Judge Hamilton directly. "Your Honor, while this incident is unfortunate, I believe we can use it constructively. If Officer Bradley is willing, perhaps he could observe today's proceedings. Sometimes the best education comes from understanding the broader context of our individual actions." The suggestion caught everyone off guard, particularly Officer Bradley himself. Instead of demanding punishment or filing complaints, the general was offering an opportunity for growth and understanding. It was a leadership approach that had served him well throughout his military career, turning moments of conflict into teachable experiences. Judge Hamilton considered the proposal carefully. "General Thompson, that's remarkably gracious of you, but I have to consider the integrity of these proceedings. Having an officer who just attempted to arrest our key witness sitting in the courtroom might appear problematic." "With respect, Your Honor," General Thompson replied, "having him present might actually strengthen our case. The discrimination that black veterans faced wasn't always overt or intentional. Sometimes it came from well-meaning people who simply couldn't see past their assumptions. Officer Bradley's reaction today, and hopefully his education today, could serve as a powerful example of how these biases manifest and how they can be addressed." Detective Martinez had been listening intently while simultaneously assessing the situation from a departmental perspective. "General Thompson, I appreciate your generosity, but Officer Bradley needs to understand the severity of his actions. This isn't just about individual bias. It's about public trust in law enforcement." Officer Walsh, who had remained largely silent, finally stepped forward. "General Thompson, sir, I want you to know that Officer Bradley's behavior doesn't represent all of us. I've learned more in the last 10 minutes about the impact of assumptions than I did in all my academy training." Her words carried genuine remorse and highlighted another dimension of the incident, the way prejudicial behavior by one officer could damage the reputation and effectiveness of entire departments, particularly among communities that already had strained relationships with law enforcement. The crowd in the corridor had grown as word spread throughout the courthouse. Attorneys involved in the veterans' rights case were particularly interested, as they recognized that this real-time demonstration of discrimination could significantly strengthen their arguments about the pervasive nature of the biases their clients had faced. The next few minutes would determine not just the immediate consequences for Officer Bradley, but potentially set precedents for how law enforcement agencies addressed bias incidents, and whether this moment would become a catalyst for broader change, or simply another example of institutional prejudice. Dr. Michael Hayes, the lead attorney representing the veterans in the discrimination case, had emerged from the courtroom upon hearing the commotion. A Harvard law graduate who had spent 15 years specializing in civil rights litigation, he immediately recognized the significance of what was unfolding. This wasn't just an unfortunate incident. It was a real-time illustration of the systematic prejudice his clients had endured for decades. "General Thompson," Dr. Hayes said, approaching with measured steps, "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you comfortable proceeding with your testimony after this encounter?" The question revealed the delicate balance that had to be maintained. General Thompson's testimony was crucial to the case, but his credibility could potentially be questioned if the defense argued that the courthouse incident had influenced his perspective or emotional state. General Thompson straightened his shoulders, the bearing of a military commander becoming evident despite his civilian attire. "Dr. Hayes, this incident doesn't change the facts of our case. If anything, it reinforces why this litigation is necessary. The discrimination that veterans faced didn't end when they left military service. It followed them into every aspect of civilian life." Officer Bradley had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. The magnitude of his mistake was becoming clearer with each passing moment. He wasn't just dealing with an embarrassing error in judgment. He had potentially compromised a federal civil rights case and demonstrated the very behavior that was at the heart of the litigation. Detective Martinez pulled Bradley aside, her voice low but firm. "Marcus, you need to understand what just happened here. This isn't going away with an apology or a written reprimand. General Thompson is a four-star general testifying in a federal discrimination case, and you just provided a textbook example of racial profiling in front of dozens of witnesses, including federal court officers." The reality of his situation was finally penetrating Bradley's defensive mindset. His 15-year career, his pension, his reputation, all of it was now at risk because of 60 seconds of prejudicial judgment. Meanwhile, Judge Hamilton was consulting quietly with her clerk and court security chief about how to proceed. The incident had created an unusual situation where the courthouse itself had become part of the narrative of the case being heard within its walls. General Thompson approached Officer Bradley directly, extending his hand in a gesture that surprised everyone present. "Officer Bradley, I'm going to make you an offer. Instead of filing a formal complaint, I'd like to invite you to listen to today's testimony, not as punishment but as education." Bradley stared at the extended hand, understanding that this moment would define not just the immediate aftermath of his mistake, but potentially the trajectory of his entire career. Accepting the general's offer would require him to confront his own biases publicly, but rejecting it would likely result in formal disciplinary action and possible termination. "General Thompson," Bradley said slowly, finally taking the offered hand, "I don't understand why you're offering me this opportunity, but I accept." The handshake between the two men created a moment of visual symbolism that wasn't lost on the assembled crowd. Here was a black veteran who had faced discrimination throughout his career, offering grace and education to a white police officer who had just demonstrated the same prejudice. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to strengthen his case, while also supporting General Thompson's leadership approach. "Your Honor, if I may suggest, perhaps Officer Bradley's presence and any insights he gains from today's proceedings could be valuable not just for his own education, but as a model for law enforcement training programs." Judge Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. "General Thompson, your magnanimity in this situation is remarkable, but I want to ensure that Officer Bradley understands this isn't a reprieve from accountability. There will still be a full investigation of this incident." "I understand, Your Honor," Bradley replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And General Thompson, I want you to know that I'm beginning to realize how wrong I was. I'm ready to listen and learn." As the group prepared to enter the courtroom, the real education was about to begin. Would Officer Bradley's presence during the testimony transform his understanding of discrimination? Or would this gesture of grace be wasted on someone too entrenched in his biases to change? The courtroom's mahogany panels and brass fixtures had witnessed countless moments of justice over the decades, but rarely had the space itself become such an integral part of the story being told within its walls. As Judge Hamilton called the session to order, the unusual presence of Officer Bradley in the gallery served as a living reminder of the discrimination that had brought everyone together. Dr. Hayes stood to address the court, his opening statement taking on new relevance given the morning's events. "Your Honor, the case before us today involves more than historical injustices. It involves patterns of discrimination that persist to this day, as we unfortunately witnessed just moments ago in this very courthouse." The defense attorney, Robert Thornton, a partner at one of D.C.'s most prestigious firms, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His strategy had been to argue that any discrimination veterans faced was a product of different times and outdated policies that had long since been reformed. The incident with Officer Bradley had just undermined that argument before he'd even had a chance to make it. General Thompson was called to the witness stand, his bearing transforming the moment he raised his right hand to take the oath. Gone was the elderly man in the worn grey suit. In his place stood a military commander whose presence commanded respect from everyone in the room. "General Thompson," Dr. Hayes began, "please tell the court about your military service and how it prepared you for today's testimony." "I enlisted in the Army in 1961 as an 18-year-old private from rural Alabama," General Thompson began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Over the next 42 years, I served in Vietnam, Korea, and various bases around the world, eventually rising to the rank of four-star general." Officer Bradley leaned forward in his seat, beginning to understand the magnitude of the man he had attempted to arrest less than an hour earlier. During your service, Dr. Hayes continued, did you encounter discrimination based on your race? Regularly, General Thompson replied without hesitation. From fellow soldiers who questioned my authority, to commanding officers who assigned me to lesser roles despite my qualifications, to Veterans Affairs personnel who later denied benefits that were routinely granted to white veterans with identical service records. The testimony that followed was both educational and devastating. General Thompson methodically outlined decades of systematic discrimination, providing specific examples and documentation that painted a clear picture of institutional bias within the military and veterans services systems. Officer Bradley found himself taking mental notes, recognizing patterns of behavior that he now realized he had exhibited throughout his own career. The assumptions, the quick judgments, the tendency to see certain people as not belonging in particular spaces, all of it was being dissected and exposed under the bright lights of federal court. General Thompson, Dr. Hayes said, approaching a crucial moment in the testimony, can you explain to the court how these discriminatory practices affected veterans' ability to reintegrate into civilian society? The discrimination didn't end when we hung up our uniforms, General Thompson replied, his eyes briefly meeting Officer Bradley's across the courtroom. It followed us into job interviews, bank loan applications, interactions with law enforcement, and yes, even into government buildings, where we sought the benefits we had earned through our service. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Here was a veteran testifying about discrimination in government buildings while sitting just yards away from a police officer who had demonstrated that very behavior. Defense Attorney Thornton rose for cross-examination, his earlier confidence clearly shaken by the morning's events. General Thompson, isn't it possible that some of these incidents you describe were misunderstandings rather than intentional discrimination? General Thompson's response was measured but firm. Mr. Thornton, when a pattern of misunderstandings consistently affects people of one race while sparing others, it stops being coincidence and becomes systemic discrimination. The exchange continued for nearly 2 hours, with General Thompson providing detailed accounts of discriminatory practices that had affected thousands of veterans. His testimony was made more powerful by his calm demeanor and obvious credibility, qualities that had been apparent to everyone except Officer Bradley during their initial encounter. During a brief recess, Officer Bradley approached Detective Martinez. I need to understand something, he said quietly. How did I become the kind of officer who would try to arrest a 4-star general simply because of how he looked? Detective Martinez studied her colleague's face, seeing genuine confusion and growing awareness. Marcus, that's the first intelligent question you've asked all day. The answer is that it happened gradually, through small assumptions and unchallenged biases that built up over 15 years. As the court session resumed, Officer Bradley was about to hear testimony that would fundamentally challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, service, and the responsibilities of those who wear badges. When court resumed, Dr. Hayes called his next witness, Colonel Patricia Williams, Raytheons, a decorated military nurse who had served alongside General Thompson during the final years of the Vietnam conflict. Her testimony would provide a different perspective on the discrimination that black service members faced, particularly focusing on the challenges faced by black women in the military. Officer Bradley watched as Colonel Williams took the stand, noting her dignified bearing and the respect she commanded from everyone in the courtroom. At 65, she carried herself with the same quiet authority that had marked General Thompson's demeanor, and Bradley found himself wondering how many other distinguished veterans he had encountered without recognizing their service. Colonel Williams, Dr. Hayes began, please describe your military service and your interactions with then-Lieutenant Thompson. I served as a surgical nurse in field hospitals from 1968 to 1972, Colonel Williams replied, her voice strong despite her years. Lieutenant Thompson was brought to my unit after being wounded during a reconnaissance mission. What struck me immediately wasn't just his injuries, but the way some medical personnel treated him differently than white officers with similar wounds. The testimony that followed revealed a troubling pattern of discrimination within military medical facilities. Colonel Williams described incidents where black soldiers received substandard care, were discharged prematurely, or had their injuries minimized in medical records, decisions that would later affect their eligibility for disability benefits. There was an unspoken hierarchy, Colonel Williams continued. White officers received private rooms and immediate attention. Black soldiers, regardless of rank, were often placed in overcrowded wards and had to wait longer for treatment. I documented these disparities in my reports, but they were consistently dismissed as resource allocation decisions. Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he began to understand how systemic discrimination operated, not through overt hostility, but through seemingly neutral policies that consistently disadvantage certain groups. He recognized similar patterns in his own police work, where certain neighborhoods received faster response times and certain types of calls were prioritized over others. Detective Martinez, who had remained in the courtroom to observe the proceedings, noticed Bradley's growing discomfort and recognized it as a positive sign. Real change often began with discomfort, the unsettling realization that long-held beliefs and practices were fundamentally flawed. Colonel Williams, Dr. Hayes continued, "Did these discriminatory practices continue after your military service ended?" "Absolutely," she replied. "When I applied for Veterans Affairs benefits, my medical records had been lost 3 separate times. It took 7 years and the intervention of a civil rights attorney to receive the disability rating I deserved. During that time, I watched white male veterans with less severe injuries receive their benefits within months." The pattern was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom, including Officer Bradley. This wasn't about individual bad actors or isolated incidents. It was about institutional systems that consistently produced unequal outcomes. Defense attorney Thornton's cross-examination focused on trying to attribute these disparities to bureaucratic inefficiency rather than intentional discrimination. But Colonel Williams's detailed documentation and calm recitation of facts made his arguments appear increasingly weak. During her testimony, Colonel Williams made eye contact with Officer Bradley several times, recognizing him as the officer from the morning's incident. Her expression wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, it conveyed a kind of weary understanding, as if she had seen his type of reaction countless times before. "Colonel Williams," Thornton pressed, "isn't it possible that these delays and disparities were simply the result of an overburdened system rather than deliberate discrimination?" "Mr. Thornton," she replied with quiet dignity, "when a system consistently fails people of one race while efficiently serving others, the burden is on that system to explain why. Incompetence that selectively affects black veterans while sparing white ones isn't incompetence. It's discrimination." The answer resonated throughout the courtroom, particularly with Officer Bradley, who began to understand how his own routine security checks seemed to disproportionately target people who looked like General Thompson and Colonel Williams. As Colonel Williams concluded her testimony, she looked directly at Officer Bradley. "Young man," she said, addressing him from the witness stand, "I hope you're learning something today. The uniform you wear should protect and serve all citizens equally, regardless of what assumptions you might make about their appearance or their right to be in any particular place." Her words hit Officer Bradley like a physical blow, forcing him to confront not just his actions that morning, but the entire pattern of behavior that had led to this moment of reckoning. The afternoon session brought testimony from Dr. James Morrison, a psychologist who specialized in studying the long-term effects of discrimination on veterans' mental health and community reintegration. His research had documented patterns that extended far beyond individual cases, revealing systematic disparities that affected entire generations of black service members. "Dr. Morrison," Dr. Hayes began, "please explain to the court how discrimination affects veterans' ability to transition to civilian life." "The psychological impact of discrimination doesn't end when the discriminatory act ends," Dr. Morrison explained, adjusting his glasses as he referenced his extensive research. "Veterans who face consistent bias develop what we call hypervigilance, a constant awareness that they may be judged, questioned, or treated differently based on their race rather than their qualifications or service record." Officer Bradley found this explanation uncomfortably familiar. He realized that General Thompson's calm demeanor during their confrontation might have been the result of decades of similar encounters, a learned response to prejudicial treatment that had begun during his military service and continued throughout his civilian life. "This hypervigilance," Dr. Morrison continued, "affects everything from job interviews to interactions with law enforcement to seeking medical care. Veterans learn to modify their behavior, their appearance, even their expectations to minimize the risk of discriminatory treatment. The testimony painted a picture of exhaustion, the constant mental and emotional energy required to navigate a society that viewed their service through the lens of racial prejudice rather than recognizing their contributions and sacrifices. Can you provide specific examples of how this manifests in daily life? Dr. Hayes asked. Certainly. We documented cases where black veterans were questioned about their right to be in VFW halls, despite their membership. Others reported being followed by security guards in stores when wearing military-themed clothing that on white veterans would be seen as patriotic. Many described being stopped by police officers who assumed they couldn't afford the cars they were driving or questioned their presence in certain neighborhoods. Each example hit Officer Bradley like a hammer blow. He began to recognize his own behavior patterns in Dr. Morrison's descriptions, the quick assumptions, the automatic suspicion, the tendency to question certain people's right to occupy particular spaces. Detective Martinez watched Bradley's reaction carefully, noting the visible discomfort and growing self-awareness. She had seen this transformation before in officers who participated in bias training, but rarely in such a dramatic, real-time context. Dr. Morrison, Defense Attorney Thornton interjected during cross-examination, couldn't these incidents be attributed to general crime prevention measures rather than racial discrimination? Mr. Thornton, our research controlled for multiple variables including location, time of day, and behavior patterns. The disparities we documented cannot be explained by legitimate security concerns. When black veterans are questioned or detained at rates significantly higher than white veterans exhibiting identical behavior, we're looking at discrimination, not crime prevention. The answer resonated particularly strongly with Officer Bradley, who began to question his own justifications for the stops and encounters that had defined much of his career. How many times had he told himself he was just being thorough or following proper procedure, when in reality he was responding to unconscious biases? As Dr. Morrison's testimony continued, he presented statistical evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic disadvantage. Black veterans were more likely to be denied home loans, less likely to be hired for civilian positions despite identical qualifications, and more likely to experience negative interactions with law enforcement. The cumulative effect, Dr. Morrison explained, is that veterans who served their country with distinction return to find that their service is valued differently based on their race. This creates not just individual trauma, but community-wide distrust of institutions that should be supporting all veterans equally. Officer Bradley found himself thinking about his own family's military history. His grandfather, who had served in World War II and returned to a hero's welcome, his brother, who had leveraged his military service into a successful career in law enforcement. He began to understand that the respect and opportunities his family had received weren't automatically extended to all veterans. During a brief recess, General Thompson approached Officer Bradley. "How are you processing all of this?" he asked with genuine concern. "Sir," Bradley replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm beginning to understand that I've been part of the problem without even realizing it." The admission marked a crucial turning point, the moment when defensive justification began to transform into genuine understanding and the possibility of real change. The final witness of the day was Sergeant Major Robert Jackson, Retty, a Vietnam veteran whose case had become emblematic of the systematic denial of benefits that formed the core of the lawsuit. At 74, he walked with a pronounced limp from injuries sustained during combat, injuries that the Veterans Affairs system had initially classified as non-service related, despite extensive medical documentation. Officer Bradley watched Sergeant Major Jackson take the stand and felt a familiar stirring, not of suspicion this time, but of recognition. There was something in the older man's bearing that reminded him of his own grandfather, a dignity that transcended circumstances and spoke to decades of service and sacrifice. "Sergeant Major Jackson," Dr. Hayes began, "please tell the court about your military service and your subsequent experiences with the Veterans Affairs system." "I served 2 tours in Vietnam as an infantry sergeant," Jackson replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a career soldier. "During my 2nd tour, our unit was hit by mortar fire. I sustained shrapnel wounds to my left leg and back, injuries that required multiple surgeries and left me with permanent mobility issues." Jackson's testimony revealed a bureaucratic nightmare that had lasted over 30 years. Despite clear medical records documenting his combat injuries, the VA had repeatedly denied his disability claims, requiring him to undergo multiple examinations and provide documentation that seemed to mysteriously disappear from his file. The strangest part, Jackson continued, was watching white soldiers from my own unit receive their disability ratings within months, while my case was constantly delayed, questioned, or lost in the system. We had served together, been wounded in the same attacks, but somehow their injuries were considered more legitimate than mine. Officer Bradley felt a growing sense of shame as he listened to Jackson's account. Here was a man who had sacrificed his health in service to his country, only to return home and face decades of discrimination from the very government he had sworn to protect. Sergeant Major Jackson, Dr. Hayes continued, how did these experiences affect your civilian life? They taught me to expect discrimination everywhere, Jackson replied with painful honesty. When you spend 30 years fighting for benefits you clearly deserve, when you're constantly questioned and doubted despite your service record, you start to assume that every institution will treat you the same way. The statement hit Officer Bradley with particular force. He realized that his confrontation with General Thompson that morning wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a lifelong pattern of discrimination that had followed these veterans from their military service into every aspect of their civilian lives. Jackson described incidents that paralleled the morning's events with disturbing consistency, being questioned by security guards in government buildings, having police officers assume he was loitering when waiting for appointments, being treated with suspicion in spaces where his presence was not only legitimate, but earned through service and sacrifice. Did these experiences affect your trust in law enforcement? Dr. Hayes asked, a question that seemed directed as much at Officer Bradley as at the witness. Young man, Jackson said, looking directly at Bradley, I want to trust police officers. I want to believe that the uniform represents justice and protection for all citizens. But when you've been stopped and questioned simply for walking through certain neighborhoods, when officers look at you and see a threat instead of a veteran, it becomes difficult to maintain that trust. The directness of Jackson's statement, delivered without anger but with unmistakable clarity, forced Bradley to confront the real-world impact of his behavior. This wasn't about political correctness or sensitivity training. It was about fundamental justice and the promise that all citizens would be treated with equal dignity under the law. Defense attorney Thornton's cross-examination seemed increasingly futile as Jackson calmly responded to each attempt to minimize or explain away the discrimination he had documented. His credibility was unshakable, supported by decades of paperwork, medical records, and corroborating testimony from fellow veterans. Sergeant Major Jackson, Thornton tried one final approach. Do you believe that all instances of questioning by authorities are necessarily discriminatory? Jackson considered the question carefully before responding. Mr. Thornton, I understand that law enforcement has legitimate duties to perform, but when questioning consistently targets people who look like me, while ignoring others engaged in identical behavior, when the assumption is always that we don't belong rather than that we do, then yes, that's discrimination. As Jackson's testimony concluded, Judge Hamilton announced a recess before closing arguments. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as people processed what they had heard, but Officer Bradley sat in silence, overwhelmed by the weight of testimony that had fundamentally challenged his understanding of justice, service, and his own role in perpetuating the very discrimination these veterans had spent decades fighting. Detective Martinez approached him during the break. Marcus, I can see this has been difficult for you. How are you processing everything you've heard? Bradley looked up at his supervisor, his face reflecting a transformation that had been building throughout the day. I'm beginning to understand that I need to completely rethink everything I thought I knew about being a police officer. Dr. Hayes rose for his closing argument, the weight of the day's testimony evident in his measured approach to the lectern. The incident with Officer Bradley that morning had provided an unexpected but powerful illustration of the very discrimination his clients had endured for decades. Your Honor, members of the jury, Dr. Hayes began, today you have heard testimony from decorated veterans whose service to this country is beyond question, but you have also witnessed in real time the continuation of the discrimination they have faced throughout their civilian lives. He gestured toward Officer Bradley, who sat in the gallery with his head bowed. still processing the full impact of his actions and their broader implications. This morning, a four-star general was nearly arrested in this very courthouse simply because his appearance didn't match someone's assumptions about who belongs in federal buildings. That incident wasn't an aberration. It was a perfect example of the systematic bias that has denied these veterans their rightful benefits and respect for decades. General Thompson listened to the closing argument with the same calm dignity he had displayed throughout the day, occasionally glancing toward Officer Bradley with an expression that conveyed understanding rather than condemnation. Defense Attorney Thornton's closing argument focused on legal technicalities and procedural requirements, but his earlier confidence had been thoroughly undermined by the day's events. It was difficult to argue that discrimination was a thing of the past when it had been demonstrated so clearly in the courthouse that very morning. Judge Hamilton's instructions to the jury were comprehensive, emphasizing their responsibility to consider not just the legal evidence, but the broader patterns of discrimination that had been documented through testimony and exhibits. The question before you, Judge Hamilton concluded, is not whether these veterans deserve respect for their service. That is beyond dispute. The question is whether our legal system will acknowledge and remedy the systematic discrimination they have faced and ensure that such treatment ends. As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom slowly emptied, but several key figures remained behind. General Thompson approached Officer Bradley, who stood uncertain and clearly struggling with the day's revelations. "Officer Bradley," General Thompson said gently, "I want you to know that your presence here today, your willingness to listen and learn, gives me hope. Real change happens one person at a time, one moment of understanding at a time." Bradley looked up, his eyes reflecting a mixture of shame and determination. "General Thompson, I don't know how to apologize for what I did this morning, but I want you to know that I will never make the same mistake again." "The apology is accepted," General Thompson replied, "but more importantly, I want you to take what you've learned today back to your fellow officers. Help them understand that the uniform they wear should protect and serve all citizens equally." Detective Martinez joined the conversation, recognizing an opportunity to turn this incident into a broader learning experience. "General Thompson, would you be willing to speak to our department about today's events? I think Officer Bradley's experience could be valuable for other officers." "I would be honored," General Thompson replied. "Education and understanding are the only ways we can prevent these incidents from recurring." 6 months later, Officer Bradley stood before a room full of police recruits at the Metropolitan Police Academy, sharing his story with a vulnerability that would have been unimaginable before his encounter with General Thompson. "I want to tell you about the day I almost arrested a four-star general," he began, the familiar shame still evident in his voice, but now tempered by purpose, and how that mistake taught me what it really means to protect and serve. The story had become a central part of the department's bias training program, with Bradley's transformation serving as a powerful example of how personal growth could emerge from confronting difficult truths about prejudice and assumption. General Thompson had indeed spoken to the police department, his presentation focusing not on punishment, but on education. His approach had been so effective that other law enforcement agencies had requested similar sessions, turning the courthouse incident into a catalyst for broader change. The veterans' lawsuit had resulted in a landmark settlement that provided benefits and compensation to thousands of black veterans who had been systematically denied their rightful support. More importantly, it had led to comprehensive reforms in how Veterans Affairs processed claims and treated all veterans. Sergeant Major Jackson had lived to see his disability rating corrected and his benefits restored, but more significantly, he had witnessed the beginning of systemic changes that would prevent future veterans from enduring the discrimination he had faced for 3 decades. Colonel Williams had been appointed to a Veterans Affairs Advisory Committee tasked with ensuring that the reforms implemented as a result of the lawsuit were properly maintained and expanded. Officer Bradley's transformation had been so complete that he had requested a transfer to the department's Community Relations Division, where he worked specifically on building trust between law enforcement and communities that had historically experienced discriminatory treatment. The courthouse corridor where the initial confrontation had occurred now featured a small plaque commemorating the case and its outcomes, serving as a reminder that justice sometimes emerges from the most unexpected moments of conflict and misunderstanding. Detective Martinez had been promoted and now oversaw bias training programs throughout the region, using the Bradley Thompson incident as a case study in how individual moments of prejudice could become catalysts for institutional change. Most importantly, the story had become part of the ongoing conversation about justice, service, and the responsibility that comes with wearing any uniform, whether military or law enforcement, that represents the ideals of equality and protection for all citizens. What an incredible journey we've witnessed today, from a moment of prejudice and misunderstanding to a transformation that changed not just individual lives, but entire institutions. The story of General Thompson and Officer Bradley reminds us that real change often begins with the courage to confront our own biases and the wisdom to turn moments of conflict into opportunities for growth. If you watched until the end of this powerful story, please comment "I watched until the final" below. Your engagement helps us know that these important stories are reaching people who need to hear them. This story illustrates something profound about human nature, that even our worst moments can become catalysts for positive change when we have the humility to acknowledge our mistakes and the courage to learn from them. Officer Bradley's transformation from someone who embodied discriminatory assumptions to an advocate for justice shows that redemption is possible when we're willing to do the difficult work of examining our own behavior. General Thompson's grace in turning a moment of discrimination into an educational opportunity demonstrates the kind of leadership that creates lasting change. Instead of seeking punishment or revenge, he chose understanding and growth, a choice that ultimately impacted far more lives than any punitive action could have achieved. The veterans whose stories we heard today, General Thompson, Colonel Williams, Sergeant Major Jackson, represent thousands of service members who faced discrimination despite their sacrifice and dedication to our country. Their courage in pursuing justice through the legal system has created changes that will benefit future generations of veterans. But perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that each of us has the power to choose how we respond to moments of conflict and misunderstanding. We can choose defensiveness and denial, or we can choose growth and understanding. We can perpetuate harmful patterns, or we can become agents of positive change. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge us to think differently about justice, prejudice, and the power of human transformation. Share this story with others who might benefit from its message about the possibility of redemption and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. Don't forget to click on the video that appears on your screen at the end. We have more incredible stories of transformation and justice that will inspire and educate you. Remember, change begins with each of us, one interaction at a time, one moment of understanding at a time.